Pledge allegiance, begin.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Friends, let us pray. As we've been called together today to ponder the question, do we have the will? God, as we gather today to celebrate the life and the legacy of Dr. King, to ponder if we have the will to finish the work of justice and peace, we ask you, God, to help us to remain woke through this great revolution of change that you are calling us to. God, in addressing these issues like systemic racism and poverty and voting rights, to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots. God, we ask that you bless the speaker today, that you open our hearts and our ears as they call upon us to pray with our feet and our hands as well as our mouths. And as you call us, God, let us respond with an amen, an ashe, and a yes, Lord. Knowing that if we squander this moment, we succumb to the darkness for which you gave us light. God, you have given us, even in a pandemic, the techniques and the resources to rid ourselves of these ills, of poverty, of racism, of injustice of every kind. And it is us, God, that you have called to this knock at the door of humanity at midnight. And so we ask that you let us answer and not let us relegate our will to apathy, to pessimism, or silence. But God, we pray today, as you move upon our hearts, that we act decisively, that we act courageously, and that we act faithfully. In Jesus' name, amen and ashe.
Good morning and welcome to the 2022 MLK Day Community Commemoration Service. And this year we're virtual. This year's commemoration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. comes amidst particularly challenging times. The COVID pandemic persists and remains especially devastating to communities of color. Out of an abundance of caution and a desire to protect the safety of the beloved community, we've concluded that the virtual format is again the best approach for this year's service. Add to the challenge of the pandemic the national regression that we are seeing in voter protection and voter rights. Attacks on the hard-fought gains of the freedom movement to expand the voting franchise led members of Dr. King's family to encourage MLK Day events to prioritize voting rights, specifically through calling on the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. though the message from the family was misconstrued as no passage, no celebration, we agree with Reverend Bernice King, Martin Luther King's daughter, and the director of the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, that we must continue commemoration events, but in a manner that mobilizes our communities on this critical issue. To that end, we are proud to share that all of the federal elected officials that are participating in this commemoration have voted for in favor of the legislation. And our state and local elected officials support and are expanding the voting franchise here in New York State and in our community. As we fight to protect and expand the right to determine our leaders and our community's priorities, we also heed Dr. King's message about the need for economic justice. Our theme this year is Do We Have the Will? In a sermon entitled Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, given at the National Cathedral on March 31st, 1968, Dr. King uttered these words. This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The question is whether America will do it. Dr. King went on to say, there is nothing new about poverty. What is new is that now we have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will. This topic is especially urgent given the trillions of dollars of stimulus the federal government is currently distributing, which could fundamentally change the trajectory of our economy and begin to close the gaping income disparities about which Dr. King warned us over 50 years ago. Efforts like the North Star Coalition call on our community and its leaders to prioritize our most economically marginalized residents, recognizing that that is the most promising route to a vibrant and growing economy. As Dr. King admonishes, the tools, the techniques, the approaches have already been developed. We know that we can greenline the economy as an antidote to historical redlining. We are learning about and embracing transformative climate communities as a response to climate change, which centers the economically vulnerable and historically marginalized in a just transition to a regenerative economy. It is indisputable that we must ensure that hiring and entrepreneurial opportunities, especially in innovation-based industries, is equitable and inclusive. The only question now is, do we have the will? Well, here at the MLK Commission, we remain fundamentally optimistic that we can and will muster our collective will. We're using this MLK Day to recommit, despite the opposition, overcoming the challenges, to summon the will, to realize our beloved community. This event should leave you inspired, and to get us rolling, let's turn over to the Martin Luther King Choir.
He's up. Oh, bless his name.
Oh, he's mighty. And if that hasn't gotten you warmed up on a cold morning, I don't know what will. Let's take a moment to hear from some of our federal elected representatives.
Hi, everyone. It's Senator Chuck Schumer. And first, I want to recognize the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission for organizing today's commemoration. My friends, today's a very special day. Today, we honor the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man whose words and deeds accomplished nothing less than the elevation of the human race. It's no coincidence that MLK Day is the only day on our calendar, the only one dedicated to a single American. We have Mother's Day for all the mothers, Father's Day for the fathers, July 4th for our nation's founders and patriots, President's Day for the presidents, and Veterans Day for all our veterans. But only one day for one man. And that's deservedly so, because Dr. King was singular, exceptional, unique. With his strength, with his courage, he lifted a giant mirror upon his broad shoulders, and with eloquence, brilliance, and faith, he forced America to look into that mirror, and America didn't like what he saw. It began the long trek towards eliminating inequality, a trek we are still very much on. Dr. King unflinchingly exposed our worst impulses, and in doing so, he inspired the better angels of our nature. Because of that, he has made America a better place and made each and every one of us a better person. That's why back when I was a young congressman in the early 80s, I fought to make MLK Day a federal holiday in the face of ignorance and bigotry and cynicism. Dr. King's impact on our nation was truly vast. Many people remember him for the righteous battle he waged to secure civil rights of Black Americans, and he was also a great champion for economic justice. In fact, when Dr. King tragically was assassinated in Memphis, he was there to attend a garbage workers' strike, and he broadened the push for racial equality to also include economic justice. So in honor of his legacy, it is my responsibility and all of our responsibilities to never avert our gaze from the economic as well as the racial injustices that continue to plague our society. Dr. King spent every hour of his life in public service, right up to the end, fighting for what's right. The American Rescue Plan, the ARP, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that passed Congress last year both prioritized economic justice. The Rescue Plan put money directly in the pockets of working people by providing direct payments averaging $5,600 for a family of 4. It expanded the child tax credit for up to $3,600 per child to combat Rochester's unacceptable poverty rate. It helped tenants pay the rent, boosted Rochester's public transit, and gave direct aid to restaurants and live entertainment venues to keep employees on the payroll. The Infrastructure Act will expand affordable internet access for over 5 million New Yorkers, help remediate the old lead pipes around Rochester and the region, and it will modernize our highways, bridges, and airports, while also funding the teardown of the Inner Loop North, a legacy of short-sighted and often unfair urban planning in the past. Our work is not done there. We must, as my friends, we have to commemorate Dr. King's memory and spirit today and redouble our commitment to stamping out economic injustice once and for all. If we can do that, if we can finally succeed in making our society truly equal, then one day, the solemnity of Martin Luther King Jr. Day will be a thing of the past, and we'll be able to celebrate this holiday with parades and laughter for the victory we have finally achieved over inequality and racism in America. One day. Thank you for letting me join you to honor one of America's greatest citizens to ever grace our country. May he continue to be a stirring example for all of us in the days ahead. So God bless you. God bless the Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission, and God bless the United States of America.
Hi, I'm Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and it's my honor to join you in celebrating the life and legacy of one of America's greatest heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The work that the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission does to carry out Dr. King's legacy has never been more important. There's no question that the pandemic has been challenging for all of us. But, like all crises, it has hit communities of color and low-income communities the hardest. and it has magnified the inequities that plague our society. This is why I continue to fight for an inclusive economic recovery. This recovery is, as Dr. King said in 1968, America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The question is whether America will do it. When it comes to fighting poverty, we have the techniques and we have the resources. And I know that you all have the will. I want you to know that I'm working every day in Washington to fight for our shared values and for economic justice. I see it as my responsibility to make sure that our work in Washington leads to a recovery that includes every community and addresses everyone's needs. We can do that by ensuring that the resources we send to New York are used to address the inequities that exist everywhere, from healthcare to economic opportunity to education. I had the chance to speak with many of you about those goals at the town hall with the Rochester Area Community Foundation this spring. And in November, I had the privilege to stand with many of you at the kickoff of the North Star Coalition, which will help us realize this vision. I was also proud to fight for the infrastructure bill to include a provision to hire local workers to address the physical and economic harm caused by the highways like the Inner Loop. And I will continue to fight for an inclusive recovery in Build Back Better bill. I look forward to continuing to work together to honor Dr. King's legacy by building a stronger, more equitable Rochester. Thank you again. I send my best wishes for a great event today.
Hello, I'm Congressman Joe Morelli. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's event at a critical moment in American history. But I'd like to begin by thanking you all for the faith and devotion to the causes inspired by Dr. King's legacy, moral and economic justice. I'm humbled to stand alongside all of you in this fight, and I'm truly grateful for everything that you do. Our democracy is more fragile today than it has been in decades. Each day we awake to a world more frightening and more imperiled than the day before. Gun violence, educational inequities, structural racism, lack of economic opportunity, all barriers holding millions of Americans back from reaching their full potential. Add to this a global pandemic that persists despite our best efforts, inflicting pain both in body and in spirit. And communities of color bear the greatest burden of all. Dr. King once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And the threats we face today are very real. State lawmakers introduced over 440 voter suppression bills in 49 states in the 2021 legislative session alone. Republican-appointed judges are erasing hard-won voter protections and diminishing our democracy right before our eyes. And this wave of voter suppression and election sabotage will only intensify in 2022. The National Republican Party has concluded that they can no longer prevail unless they change the rules. So changing the rules is what they're all about. It's criminal, it's unconscionable, and yet this is the reality we face. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This Congress, House Democrats were able to secure what can be transformative investments in working families and set a course for economic equality. Expanded child tax credits, early childhood education, child care assistance, and reduced drug prices for senior citizens. Efforts to make these victories stick have proved elusive. We now find ourselves on the precipice of a national travesty resulting from the calculated disenfranchisement of minority voters by national Republicans. This year's observance of Dr. King's birthday must be a call to arms. Now is a time for direct action. We need to fight for free elections, fair elections, accessible elections, and pressure the United States Senate to pass voter protection legislation now, including H.R. 4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, to restore the power of the Voting Rights Act and secure fundamental rights for all Americans, all voters. The House has done its part, and now the Senate must follow suit. So we must keep pushing. We must keep fighting. We must do everything within our power to protect every American's God-given right to vote in free and fair democratic elections. Dr. King forfeited his life in the pursuit of justice. To honor his life and his legacy, we must continue his fight and pursue justice for all Americans. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Thank you, Majority Leader Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, and Congressmember Morelli. We're so grateful for the work that you are doing on the front of voter rights, protecting and ensuring this fundamental right that's critical to the function of our democracy. Feels like an uphill fight, perhaps like a mountain, but as the students from School of the Arts will remind us, ain't no mountain high enough.
Ain't no mountain high, ain't no valley low, ain't no river wide enough, baby. If you need me, call me, no matter where you are, no matter how far. Just call my name, I'll be there in a hurry. You don't have to worry, 'cause baby, there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, babe. Remember the day I set you free? I told you you could always count on me. From that day on, I made a vow I'll be there when you want me, some way, somehow. 'Cause baby, there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you. My love is alive, deep down in my heart. I will be around, so whatever you ever need, a helping hand, I'll be there on the double, just as fast as I can. 'Cause remember, there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, babe. Remember, there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you,
And now, representing New York State, our Lieutenant Governor, Brian Benjamin.
Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin. It's such an honor to be here with you at the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission's MLK Day virtual event. I want to take a moment to share some reflections today as we honor the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But today is more than celebrating the work of one man. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to carrying out his teachings of justice, peace, equality, and love. His impact was and still is immeasurable. He famously observed that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. and he himself did as much as any one person could do to bend it. He did so through his words and his actions, which were guided by his deep, abiding faith in people, something that was all the more remarkable given a lifetime confronted by injustice. But I know that despite all of the progress Dr. King made, injustices and inequities still exist more than a half century later. Today, we are confronted by our very own modern day injustices. Voting rights, once again, under siege. Democracy at perhaps its most fragile point. A nation tragically divided with little hope of uniting behind our shared values. As we celebrate his legacy, it is up to each of us to reward Dr. King's faith in people and do everything in our power to build a better and more just society. As we continue to push for historic voting rights in DC, there is still more we can do here, right in New York, to protect and expand access to the ballot box. This year, Governor Hochul and I are committed to passing a New York State Voting Rights Act to enhance protections against voter suppression and vote dilution, establish new protections against voter intimidation and deception, improve language access for voters, and require boards of elections in jurisdictions with a history of civil rights violations to obtain pre-clearance for changes to election-related policies and practices. We must remember that when we are divided, we falter. But when we are united, we can conquer anything. As Dr. King said, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And today, that hope has never been stronger in the state of New York. It is that hope that will lead us out of this pandemic. It's that hope will lead our nation out of this dark time. And it is that hope that will usher in a better, brighter future for New York for decades to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Benjamin. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Benjamin, for what you, Governor Hochul, and the New York State Legislature are doing to expand voting rights in New York. Let's be a model for the rest of the country. We do this work because of how critical it is, but we also do it as a demonstration of the beloved community, a reminder that we care for one another, that indeed, as the next piece reminds us, we are our sisters and our brother's keeper.
Manke noye a goye, moi manke noye dans lagoon, garçon solide moi, garçon solide, oui comme nous. Si m'bate comme dans lagoon, gardez m'dame noye. Kaja. Kaja, 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 kaja. Manque noyé à goé. Moi manque noyé dans la gonna, garçon solide moi. Garçon solide, oui comme nous. Bate comme non basse ça, gardez m'na vinoé. Ibolele comme no, kajabo su comme no vrai. Si bate comme non basse ça, gardez m'na vinoé. Kaja, 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 kaja. garçon solide moi. Garçon solide, oui, m'gwa mouno. Si m'bate gwa moun nan bassin ça, gade m'te noye. Oui, m'gwa moun ibo, gade m'gwa moun, ibo m'gwa mouno, nou tout gwa mouno. Oui, m'gwa moun ibo, gade m'gwa moun, comme a tchoulé. Ibo m'gwa mouno, nou tout gwa mouno. Oui, m'gwa moun ibo, gade m'gwa moun, ibo m'gwa mouno, nou tout gwa mouno. Manke noye a goe, moi manke noye dans la gona, garçon solide moi.
Thank you, Vittorio June, for choreographing such a beautiful and powerful piece. And thank you to the dancers as well as to the musicians that produced the score. Let's turn our attention to the local level and hear from our county executive, Adam Bello, and Malik D. Evans, the 71st mayor of the city of Rochester.
My heartfelt thanks goes out to the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Greater Rochester Commission and all of the sponsors who worked so hard to put today's celebration together. I am truly honored to have been invited to participate in today's event. In one of his sermons, Dr. King once said, "Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" I firmly believe that if you dedicate your life to public service, this must be the guiding principle in how you govern. As we recover from the unprecedented stresses of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to heed the words and deeds of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and ensure our recovery efforts embrace equitable practices and that our efforts allow all residents of Monroe County to thrive. Every day, as your county executive, I have the awesome responsibility of ensuring the people of this county feel supported and that they have what they need to be successful. I believe government can and should be a force for good in people's lives. My role as a leader is to help everyone succeed to their fullest potential. And doing that requires being a convener who brings people together from every corner of the county and listens to them so that we may solve our problems collectively and create new opportunities. Government must work for everyone, no matter their race, religion, color, status, who they love, or the zip code they live in. For me, these aren't just words that I say, but beliefs I back up with actions. We're confronting many of the ugly truths that persist in our community, having difficult conversations and charting new paths forward. Dr. King shared his dream for equity, justice, and freedom, and Monroe County, in partnership with Mayor Evans and the City of Rochester, is making strides to realize those dreams. In my first year as Monroe County Executive, I created the Race Commission in partnership with the City of Rochester. This commission was tasked with taking a clear-eyed look at the policies and practices of Monroe County with an aim to identify and eliminate instances of systemic racism and barriers embedded in county government that unfairly hold people back, creating disproportionate outcomes for Black and brown citizens. We have already begun implementing recommendations from the Race Commission, raising the county workforce minimum wage to $15 an hour, creating the first ever County Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which will soon be rolling out a county MWBE certification program, and the development of a new financial incentive program to support micro enterprises in underserved parts of the county and neighborhoods in the city. The commitment to equity must be at every level, and that's why we're stripping away bureaucratic barriers to accessing vital human services assistance. Our service integration initiative will make people's lives better by bringing vital services to the people through trusted community-based organizations instead of making people come to us. These are all real, concrete steps that will help us move towards equity, justice, and healing. But I know the work is not done. The theme of today's event is, do we have the will? When it comes to taking action, that doing what it takes to bridge the gaps between the haves and the have-nots. I believe we do. I believe we must. And like Dr. King, I believe in the fierce urgency of now, especially when it comes to confronting racism, injustice, and economic inequality. Again, I thank you for inviting me to join you here today and for providing me the guidance and support I know that you will continue to do the work and hold leaders like me accountable in our efforts for justice and equity. Thank you. Take care of yourself, take care of each other, and may God bless all of you.
Greetings. Dr. King said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." I'm Malik Evans, Mayor of the City of Rochester. It is with great enthusiasm that I stand before you on this day, the day that Americans all across the nation celebrate the life and work of the ultimate orator and most visible leader of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He stood up for black men, women, and children in America. Risking his own life, he stood up for the poor. He spoke truth to power and fought to bring economic, racial harmony, and social justice to all people. He held America accountable for the marginalization and unequal treatment of African Americans, and he left an indelible positive imprint on humanity. I'm grateful to Simeon Bannister and the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission for holding this wonderful celebration each year and inviting me to share a few words. Today's theme is, do we have the will? I'd say emphatically, yes. Dr. King's philosophy has been passed down from generation to generation. When Dr. King was assassinated at the age of 39, he was just a few years younger than I am today. Yet his legacy lives on, not only through his family, but through every leader and individual who adopted Dr. King's ethos. And that's what we are cultivating today at City Hall. Our vision is to build bridges to Rochester's future. We are committed to providing transparent and collaborative leadership. Like Dr. King, we will continue the fight for freedom, justice, equity, and equality for all people. But we cannot romanticize Dr. King's struggle. We cannot romanticize the struggles of our ancestors and all of who've come before us. We cannot forget Dr. King and the unsung heroes and heroines who were hosed down for standing up for justice. We cannot forget those young, brave college students, mothers, fathers, and grandparents who were beaten with billy clubs for standing up for equal rights. We cannot forget those who were arrested and abused for refusing to be oppressed. We cannot forget the strange fruit that hung from trees, fathers stolen from their families. We cannot forget that the freedoms we have today came with an ultimate price. But we can demonstrate the will to live as Dr. King so eloquently encouraged. An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all of humanity. Together, we will continue to help our citizens thrive through this pandemic, one of the most challenging times in modern history. Together, we will work together to fight against poverty and violence for the greater good of our community. You don't have to be mayor or county executive or any other elected official to make a difference. Dr. King once said, "Everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love, and you can be that servant." And now it is my distinct pleasure to read an excerpt from our joint City of Rochester and Monroe County proclamation. Whereas, Reverend King's legacy lives on today through the efforts of the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission, the Black Lives Matter movement, the City-County Race Commission, and the many visionary leaders and agents for change who rally in unison for the promise of America. The road ahead is long and winding, but we are inspired by the commitment of so many within our community to address racial discrepancies and inequalities. As in the words of the writer James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Now, therefore, we, Malik D. Evans, Mayor of the City of Rochester, New York, and Adam Bello, Monroe County Executive, do hereby proclaim January 17th, 2022, to be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day in Monroe County and the City of Rochester, New York. Thank you, and God bless.
I will trust in the Lord all my days,
The MLK Choir is bringing it. It makes me want to take a text, but that's not my job this morning. My job this morning is to MC, so I'm going to MC. You know, it's a funny thing when in life's journey, the people that you meet along the way that become friends sometimes go off to do great things. My friend from high school is the 71st mayor of the city of Rochester. My friend from Harlem is the lieutenant governor. And now I want to introduce you to another friend of mine. Dr. Lerone A. Martin is a historian of religion in the 20th century. He's the faculty director for the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, where he will also teach in the Department of Religious Studies. His books and scholarship provide critical context for the forces of religion, politics, and race that have shaped the contemporary American political and social landscape. Dr. Martin is the award-winning author of Preaching on Wax, the Phonograph and the Making of the Modern African American Religion. This book was the 2015 recipient of the prestigious Frank S. and Elizabeth D. Brewer Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in Religious History from the American Society of Church History. Having witnessed firsthand the FBI's engagement with faith communities during the protests in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, Dr. Martin was inspired to write the forthcoming The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and the Making of White Evangelicalism. In this book, Dr. Martin draws on thousands of declassified FBI documents and interviews with retired special agents, and he explains why white evangelicals rose in the halls of power and shines a light on how the religious movement became a political force that has shaped our current politics. In support of his research, Dr. Martin has received a number of nationally recognized fellowships and grants, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Louisville Institute for the Study of American Religion, the Teagle Foundation, and the Templeton Religion Trust. But even amidst all these accolades, anybody that knows Lerone well knows that he will always center those on society's margins. He served as a research consultant for continuing education and recidivism at New York's Sing Sing prison, as well as an instructor at Georgia's Metro State Prison. He's been an instructor at the Missouri Eastern Correctional Center, and he's worked with the WashU Prison Education Program. Dr. Martin's lectures on the intersection of religion and politics in American life have been featured at national conferences, faith communities, and at the leading universities including Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, Stanford, and Georgetown. He was previously the Director of American Cultural Studies, the Associate Professor of Religion and Politics in the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, and the Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. His commentary and writing have appeared in popular national media outlets, including The Today Show, CNN, PBS, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Boston Globe, and NPR. Lerone earned his BA from Anderson University, and he and I met and became friends while he was earning his Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary before he went on to complete his PhD at Emory University in 2011. We're going to hear from that MLK choir one more time. And the voice that you'll hear immediately after that will be Dr. Lerone A. Martin.
When you're standing at a crossroad, what do you do? When the fork is in the road, what do you do? When the world is on your shoulders, against the wall?
When your back is up against the wall.
What do you do?
What do you do?
Come on, say it again. What do you do?
What do you do?
You just hold on
Hold on.
and keep the faith.
And keep the faith.
That's our message today. Keep the faith.
Keep the faith.
We've come to encourage you today. Come on, say it again. Keep the faith.
Keep the faith.
Yeah. One more time, say it. Keep the faith.
Keep the faith.
Where do you look
Where do you look?
when there's nowhere else to look?
When there's nowhere else to look.
Where do you turn
Where do you turn?
when there's nowhere else to turn?
When there's nowhere else to turn.
Where do you go
Where do you go?
when there's nowhere else to go?
When there's nowhere else to go.
What do you do?
What do you do?
Come on, we encourage you. You're in the Master's hands,
You're in the Master's
and the
hand.
Master has a plan.
The Master has a plan.
Just hold on. Hold on. And keep the faith.
Keep the faith.
Glory to his name. Come on, tell somebody, keep the faith. You can't give up. You've come too far. Come on, open your mouth and say, keep the faith. Yeah. One more time and
Greetings and happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. My name is Dr. Lerone A. Martin, and I'm the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Chair and the new faculty director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. And it gives me great pleasure to be with you. And I want to thank you all at the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission for inviting me to speak with you on today and to talk about the theme, do we have the will? When I looked up in the dictionary the definition of will, it spoke of desire and disposition. And I thought about that, and it made me think about what would it take for us on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day to cultivate the disposition and the desire to achieve economic justice and to fight against economic inequality. And I thought about three things, and being true to Martin Luther King's Baptist heritage, I decided to put them in 3 points. And they all start with D to go along with the disposition. The first, I think that we need to cultivate this disposition, this will, this desire to achieve economic justice, is to make sure that we don't divorce our economic perspectives from our faith or our moral compass. You know, for Martin Luther King, his faith was the very basis of everything that he did. For Martin Luther King, his understandings of why racism was sin was that racism literally challenged the Imago Dei, or racism challenged the idea that every human being was born in the image of God. And so what racism does is it allows for the segregator, or the person who is in a position of power based on their race, to have a false sense of superiority, that somehow they are better than the segregated. And what it does to the segregated, or those who are not in power, is it forces them to look at themselves as less than and not as good, and not as being made in the image of God. So for Martin Luther King, that's why racism is a sin. His second major concern was about war. And King obviously thought that war was wrong because of the shedding of innocent blood, of the killing of human beings. And third, King was concerned about poverty, and his faith was the basis of that concern. King took Jesus seriously when Jesus talked about caring for the least of these and looking after the sick and the widow and those who are in prison. King took that seriously, and that's where his concerns about economic justice came from. In a famous speech that he gave here at Stanford University, King talked about the other America. And he talked about in that speech about why it was so important for us to be concerned about the least of these. It was based on his faith. His faith was not divorced from his concern about the other and about the least of these. And it was something that was consistent throughout King's life. And it wasn't just about the African-American poor, but the poor in general, regardless of racial group. Two of King's most famous speeches are underlined with concerns about economic justice. King's speech at the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. Well, that march was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. King was concerned about poverty. He was concerned about economic justice, and that included everyone who was working as well. King believed that his faith led him to say that everyone deserved a livable wage, and that if we're going to be concerned about the economic plight of this country, if we are going to call ourselves religious people or people of faith, or if we're going to call ourselves people of morals, or if we're going to call this country the land of the free and the home of the brave, then we have to be concerned about those who are working and still don't have enough to have a roof over their heads, those who still don't have enough to put food on the table. King had a famous phrase where he said, all labor has dignity, and that no matter what job one had, there was dignity involved in that, and that a person should have a livable wage to be able to feed themselves and clothe their families. King was not necessarily concerned about those who were wealthy. It wasn't an indictment against them, but it was an indictment against a country that decided to make rules and regulations and to incentivize certain activities that continually kept people poor and continually kept people in debt. King's second famous speech that most of us know, the mountaintop address, well, that was given in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968, where he was marching with sanitation workers who had finally been fed up with mistreatment on the job, with lower pay than they deserved. It was not a livable wage, and with danger on the job. They did not have job safety. 2 of their colleagues recently had been crushed by a trash compactor because they didn't have job safety. So King was there in Memphis to speak to the sanitation workers and help lead a march so that sanitation workers who were literally cleaning up the trash in Memphis were on strike, trying to get better treatment, trying to get a livable wage. So King's faith was never divorced from his concerns about the economic equality. So King's will, his desire to address economic inequality, came from his faith. And if we're going to cultivate that same will, we cannot allow our faith or our moral compass, for those of us who don't belong to faith communities, we can't allow our moral compass to somehow to be excluded from our concerns about the economy and our concerns about the least of these and those who are marginalized. Our faith cannot just be about our own personal morality. It can't just concern ourselves with sexuality or gender or what we consume or don't consume, or just going to church or going to our faith community or our synagogue, or our own personal moral piety where we see ourselves as superior to other people. But our faith has to concern itself, and our morality has to concern itself with our economic behavior. Just dealing honestly with people and others in the economic marketplace. That if we're going to cultivate the will, we've got to make sure our faith and our morality is not divorced from that. Secondly, I think King would have us to think about the drum major instinct. This is a phrase that King liked to use that he borrowed from psychoanalysts about the very desire that we have within ourselves to be out front and to be first. King said that all of us had this desire. And when he gave this sermon, February 4th in 1968, the last sermon that he gave at Ebenezer Baptist Church, King talked about the drum major instinct and how this desire to be out front, to lead the parade, to be seen, to be recognized. King said that this desire, if not harnessed properly, could lead us astray. And one place King saw that it led us astray was in the free market. King talked about in the sermon about how advertisers really come after us and market and really, really prey upon this drum major instinct, this desire to be seen and recognized and out in front. And King says that this is what advertisers do, right? They come to us and they say, if you want to win that promotion, wear this cologne. If you want to get this person's romantic attention, wear this lipstick, or wear these sorts of clothes, or cut your hair this way or that way. And King says if we don't harness that drum major instinct, we'll turn to the free market and we'll focus all of our energy there on the free market and consuming and consumption in order to try to be seen. But King says that if we're going to harness and if we're going to have a drum major instinct, and all of us do, that let's make that drum major instinct, let's direct that energy towards service and the service of others. He saw that coming out of the Bible where Jesus says, so whoever among you wants to be great, let him serve. And so for King, if we're all going to have a drum major instinct, let us dedicate that to service. So if we're going to be drum majors, King would say, let us be drum majors for justice. Let us be drum majors for economic equality. Let us be drum majors for social justice. That if we're going to be out in front, if we're going to be seen and recognized, if that's our desire, let it be for service. King ends that wonderful sermon by talking about his own funeral, which is fascinating given that he was given the sermon 2 months to the day that he would die. And he said in that sermon, he hoped that when he died that people wouldn't talk about the awards that he had won. People wouldn't talk about the degrees that he had. They wouldn't talk about all the speeches that he gave, but they would talk about that he was a drum major for justice. And if we're going to harness the will to follow King's legacy and to arise to King's challenge, let us all decide that we will be drum majors for justice. And finally, I think one way that we can make sure that we harness the will to achieve economic equality in this country is to make sure, again, that we don't divorce our faith from our morality, that we harness the drum major instinct for service, and finally, that we cultivate a disposition to ask the right questions, to ask the kinds of questions about our economic activity and about why the world around us looks the way it does. Then why are certain people always on the bottom end of the totem pole? Why do we keep producing generations full of poverty, people full of poverty, while our country continues to have a rising stock market? To ask questions about the economic system, to recognize that our economic system is not inevitable. There is nothing inevitable about the way that our society looks, that there are choices that have been made and choices that continually are being made to make sure that things are the way they are. One way King talked about cultivating this disposition to ask these tough questions, he turned to the story of the Great Samaritan. And many of you who know the Bible know this story. The Great Samaritan is a story where in the Bible where Jesus is confronted by a religious authority. And they say to him, "What must I do to enter into heaven?" And Jesus tells them, "You know what it is. It is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself." And the religious authority was trying to trick Jesus. And he asked Jesus, "Well, who was my neighbor?" And Jesus told a story there that is a parable that is applicable to all of us. And Jesus told a story about a Jewish man walking from Jerusalem down to Jericho, down this meandering, winding road that goes down. And Jesus says in the story that the man is walking and he is ambushed, and he is beaten and robbed, left naked and left for dead. And Jesus says in the story that a priest comes walking down, and the priest looks at the man and sees him there, bleeding, naked and dying, left for dead, and keeps going. And then a Levite comes along, and a Levite was a religious authority and religious servant during this time in the temple. He comes along, and he sees the man there, left half naked and dying, and he keeps going. And then a Samaritan comes along, a Samaritan, someone of mixed race heritage who would have been looked down upon because of that mixed race heritage at the time, comes along and sees the Jewish man and sees him dying and picks up the man and takes him to a hotel, takes him to an inn, Jesus says, and looks after the man and leaves money with the innkeeper to make sure that the man's needs are taken care of, and says, "If this money doesn't help this man and you need more, I'll pay it when I come back." So what Jesus was trying to do and say there is that the ethnic ideas, the ethnic differences between these two individuals didn't matter, because the man who showed the man who was beaten mercy, that is his neighbor. So King liked to tell this story, and he told this story in his very last sermon on April 3rd, 1968. He told this story, and he said he liked to use his imagination about what the three men were thinking. And he says, the first man, the priest, probably walked by and said he was too busy. He was on his way to church. He couldn't help the man who was there. And the Levite came along and said that he was too busy. He had a denominational or a religious function to get to, and he couldn't touch something that was so unclean and dirty before he went to church. But then the Samaritan came along and asked the question. While the two men before him, the priest and the Levite, said, "What will happen to me?" if I help this man. If I stop and help this man, I'll be late to church. If I stop and help this man, then I'll be unclean. But Jesus says the Samaritan came along, and this is what King liked to say. The Samaritan came along and reversed the question. The Samaritan came along and said, I'm not going to ask the question about what will happen to me if I help this man. I'm going to ask the question, what will happen to him if I don't help him? And King liked to say that's the kind of disposition that we have to have. We have to always ask the question, not what will happen to me, but what will happen to the other person if I don't stop and help them. And that's the kind of disposition we have to have if we're going to have the will to move forward to achieve economic justice in this country. In honor of Martin Luther King, we have to be ready to ask the tough questions. What will happen to my neighbor if I don't get involved in this community activity? What will happen to my neighbor or the person down the street or the person on the other side of the tracks if I vote this way or if I vote that way or if I don't vote? What will happen to the person who is unhoused if I decide to take this action or that action? If we cultivate that kind of disposition to ask that kind of question, then we can have a shot at cultivating the will to move forward and engage in activities that will help us to achieve economic justice. Now, many of you may be saying, and especially some of the young people that I teach, they say that the condition that we're in, the fact that we're still talking about Martin Luther King, shows that his dream was wrong, or his dream was a pipe dream, and that nonviolence or his ideas of opposing war and poverty and racism, that those were pipe dreams, because we're still wrestling with those things today. But I like to reverse that question. I like to say that the reason why that we're still talking about Martin Luther King today is because his ideas were so relevant. It's because his ideas were so prescient that he understood what we would be confronting in this country. And he also understood that whenever we made progress in these areas along the lines of war, along the lines of racism, along the lines of poverty, that there would be a backlash. So the fact that we're still wrestling and talking about Martin Luther King in this regard is because we've had a backlash. And so the fact that we're still talking about Martin King is actually a chance for us to put the mirror in our own faces and say that King worked hard and he died working for these causes and created great change in this country, and we still have a ways to go. And that is on us. That is on us to cultivate the will to honor King's legacy and to achieve the kinds of strides and the kinds of progress that King achieved in his day. So if we're going to have the will, do we have the will is the question of the hour as we celebrate Martin King. We have to make sure that we don't divorce our faith and our morality from our economic activity. We have to make sure that we harness the drum major instinct, not for selfish ideas and not for simply going out into the marketplace looking to fulfill ourselves in the marketplace. But we have to make sure we harness the drum major instinct to work for others, that we work to serve others, that if we're going to be drum majors, as King would say, let us be drum majors for justice. And finally, if we're going to have the will, we've got to make sure we cultivate the disposition to ask the kinds of tough questions. Questions about our economic structures, questions about our own activity, questions about if I don't help the person next to me, the person across town, the person on the other side of the world, what will happen to them? Not what will happen to me, but what will happen to them. And we can cultivate that kind of attitude to make sure that we don't divorce our economic activity from our morality and our faith. If we can make sure we harness the drum major instinct for justice, and if we can harness the disposition to ask the tough questions, it is then and only then will we have the will and the desire to achieve economic greatness. and truly honor Martin Luther King on his birthday. I want to thank you all for having me. And as you celebrate Martin King, I invite you to cultivate all the virtues and values that Martin Luther King left us with. To be a drum major for justice, to not divorce your faith from your economic concerns, and to cultivate the disposition to ask the tough questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, for your compelling message. I've got 3 S's to go alongside your 3 D's. This morning, you were substantive, you were salient, and your delivery was smooth. We certainly appreciate your contributions to this morning's commemoration, and we walk away as a community ready to demonstrate that we have the will. We will ensure that our morality does not become divorced from our economic circumstances. We'll embrace the instinct to be drum majors for justice, and we will show that we have the disposition to ask the tough questions, because these times require that we do. Thank you to all for joining us this morning, and we hope that you're walking away invigorated and recommitted to the work of bringing about the beloved community. We encourage you to join with the MLK Commission in the struggle for economic justice and to protect the right to vote. We want to end this morning with just a few words of thanks for those that contributed to this program, namely Troop 169 of the Scouts of America for this morning's color guard, a heartfelt thanks to Reverend Myra Brown for her stirring invocation. Always a gratitude and tip of the cap to the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Choir and Jason Monroe and Paul Boutte. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the commissioners of the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Jr. Commission, and particularly Rashad Parker for his contributions to this morning's program. We hope that you're inspired. We hope that you're reinvigorated. We hope that you have a little pep in your step as you go off to live out and to bring to life the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And to do that, we leave you with just a few musical selections from Wamba, Africa, from the School of the Arts Musical Department, and from the Greater Rochester Martin Luther King Choir. Happy MLK Day.
we still have a great distance to go before we fulfill the dream of Martin Luther King Jr.
And now I'm tasked with figuring out how do I move forward. Because you see, I didn't want to just open the gates for young black women who had been underestimated and told they don't belong. I wanted to open those gates for Latinas and for Asian Americans. I wanted to open those gates for the undocumented and the documented. I wanted to open those gates as an ally of the LGBTQ community. I wanted to open those gates for the families that have to call themselves the victims of gun violence. I wanted to open those gates wide for everyone in Georgia because that is our state and this is our nation and we all belong here.
For when we have faced down impossible odds, when we've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't, generations of Americans have responded with a simple creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Tonight, we prove that with hope, hard work, and the people by our side, anything is possible.
When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it.
Early in the morning.
Come on, testify with us. He has done great. Blessings. Oh, his marvelous, his righteous, his excellent name. Come on, will you testify with me one more time? If God has come through for you, he has done great things. Come on, look over your life and declare he has. Nobody but God did it. Yeah. Oh, he has done great blessings. Come on, bless his name. Come on, bless his name, yeah. We bless his